Big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
It's great to see you today on this day, Thursday, September the 19th, and we're so glad that everyone could join us from coast to coast. We're delighted by the comments that we receive from you, so I just want to encourage you to speak up and let us know what you're thinking. It's just fascinating what people's insights share with us and what we can learn from you. And today I'm certainly very excited about the topic we're going to discuss today. We've got an incredible guest. And as you know, I am a student of history, and one of the fascinating things I noticed today on the historic calendar was that on this day, on Thursday, September the 19th, in 1893, the governor of New Zealand, Lord Glasgow, gave royal assent to the Electoral Act of 1893. And what's really interesting about that is it granted the country's women the right to vote. So let us not take our franchise for granted. And today we've noticed that Premier Blaine Higgs has called an election in New Brunswick for October 21. So those of you who live in New Brunswick, we wish you all the best as you discern which way you're going to vote and to determine the future of that province. Today, we are going to talk about the leader of the opposition, the so-called His Majesty's Loyal Opposition. That's certainly an anecdote that has come up within a fascinating book about Pierre Poilievre. And I can really recommend the book. I've certainly very much enjoyed it. It's called Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life by author and journalist Andrew Lawton. So I am very excited to introduce my friend Andrew Lawton. Andrew, you did a terrific job on that book, and we're so glad that you could join us to talk about your book.
Thank you. It's great to be on. I had such a whirlwind of attention and interviews and all of this when the book came out a couple of months back. So it's been a while since I've actually gotten to talk about it. So thank you.
Well, it's very timely because it's amazing. You've written for many publications around the world, Andrew, and you've done a brilliant job hosting so many radio programs and TV. You're the managing editor for True North, and you're on leave right now because you yourself have taken the leap into the grand forum of politics. So congratulations on that decision, Andrew.
Thank you. It's I don't know if it's worthy of that yet. We'll see if I'm successful or not in seeking the nomination. And it's a bit of an interesting development for me because at the time that I wrote this book, and even well after I had finished the book, I had no idea that's where life would take me in the coming months. So it's made a little bit of a change in dynamic, but the book itself stands on its own and was first and foremost written as a journalist, not as a partisan.
Indeed. Well, and on that point, I do want to just to clarify why this discussion, and I obviously we look at it from very much a policy point of view. It's not from a partisan point of view per se, but every leader of every party deserves to have their story told and understood and chronicled, because I think it gives us clues about them as leaders and what kind of policy they'll pursue. I mean, that's certainly the lens I would look at it through. And I think that if you believe in a democratic system, you take that seriously. But having said that, I did find the book very entertaining, and I certainly learned a lot through your fine work and reading style. But Andrew, why did you write this book?
I'd love to come up with a really grand, romanticized, idealized answer to that question of the moment the bolt of lightning came down and the idea just appeared in front of me. The actual answer is that my publisher asked me to. But there is a serious point, and I guess my big, grand, idealistic answer is why I took it on and why I wrote the project. And I think a part of it is for the reasons you just mentioned. I don't believe Canadians have historically been great at telling our stories. I don't think we have been interested in learning about it. And I think in general, there is this culture in the United States, whether people like it or not, that whenever someone's about to run to be president, they always release some memoir. And it's an example of their way of introducing themselves to people. And while memoirs are certainly a valuable resource, they're written in a very, very superficial way often because someone is trying to promote themselves. But in Canada, we have the opposite problem where we really don't start to wonder who the people are who are our leaders until after they've been elected. And I think that there's something about the American experience of being intrigued by leaders that I thought Canada needed. And Pierre Poilievre is long known in conservative circles in this country. And I think he's become in the last few years more of a household name nationally, but he still is an unknown to a lot of Canadians who don't really pay close attention to politics. And I thought there was enough of an interest there by me, even as someone who covers conservative politics, to help understand who this guy was, that I thought other Canadians might share that as well. And the fact that the book became a bestseller, I think reinforces that point.
So it makes an awful lot of sense. So speaking of the story then of Pierre Poilievre, can you tell us more about his early years and his story? I found it really quite touching, of the story of his mom and adoption and even his brother Patrick.
Yes, and he's actually talked about this a lot in his speeches, but he distills what was for years of his life, his reality, into basically one line that he throws into speeches, which is the adopted son of two school teachers from Calgary. And what actually happened there was his teenage mother got pregnant, did not feel she was able to care for the child, gave him up for adoption at birth. And his adopted parents, school teachers who had come to Calgary from Saskatchewan for better job opportunities, couldn't have a child of their own, adopted Pierre. They named him because his father has Franco-Saskatchewan roots. And it was a few years later that the same biological mother was pregnant again. And Marlene and Donald, who were Pierre's adopted parents, had been interested in perhaps adopting another child. So when they found out that there was another baby available from the same mother, they leapt and adopted Patrick, who is actually named after his biological grandfather, his biological mother's father. And Pierre and his half-brother Patrick were raised as siblings and grew up together. And what's been interesting is how those two have actually reconnected with their biological roots over time as well. So when Pierre became the leader of the Conservatives in September of 2022, his biological mother was there. His adopted parents were there. They've since divorced, and his father has come out as gay and was there with his partner. So you have right there the adopted son, born to a teen mother, a father who came out as gay. It's a very unique experience, but Pierre has taken from that and really kept his entire family as close as can be, which is quite interesting.
No, it's truly a fascinating background, and it struck me that it was a story that I certainly was not aware of until I think the leadership race. And is that kind of a posture that you would say that Pierre Poilievre's taken is really one of a fair amount of privacy when it comes to his own family?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. And he doesn't really score the political points that many people would or would perhaps cynically expect politicians to off of his family. And one example of this is, to fast forward several years, his daughter. His daughter has quite a severe autism diagnosis, and this was never reported anywhere until I talked about it in the book. He's not used that experience to talk about children with special needs. He's not used that experience to try to make himself more sympathetic. He's kept the private and the policy stuff oriented on policy. I think that perhaps as the campaign goes on, his family will just necessarily become a little bit more a part of the conversation. I know his wife, Anna, has become an incredible force on the campaign that's become almost a politician in her own right, just by virtue of speaking out and writing op-eds. But generally, he's been a tremendously private person, and it actually made it quite challenging to be his biographer, because there was so little about this part of his life that was available to me and that was accessible.
So when we reflect on his upbringing as a young child, a man, was it fairly normal? It sounds like he had a paper route. He did a variety of jobs and things like that around the home. Was it pretty well, by all accounts, normal?
Well, it's funny because we've just talked about all the reasons that it wasn't normal and all the eccentricities of his childhood and his circumstances that made his experience different from everyone else. The term he's used to describe that is that he just has a quote unquote mixed up family. But in terms of his actual upbringing and what he did and enjoyed as a child, it was incredibly ordinary. He played hockey for a bit. He was very much into wrestling. Now, he grew up in Calgary, and people may remember that the Hart family, the wrestling family, was this dynastic force in Calgary in that time period in the late 70s and early 80s and into the 90s. And his mother actually had a connection through her teaching career to one of the Harts. So Poilievre was able to, I think, have one of them at his birthday party one year. His dad built a wrestling ring in their yard, but he was interested in all the same things that any other young boy growing up in suburban Calgary would have been at the time. Where he diverged from that would have been in his teenage years, where most of them were probably interested in sports, and he was going the politics route.
And into, of course, studies in university at the University of Calgary. Can you tell us more about his studies and involvement in debating and the United Nations Club? It seems like that played a pretty formative role in his, frankly, his debating styles today.
Yes, and he was a good student. I spoke to one of his professors who said, absolutely, he was great. He was in the top three in this class, which was, I believe, a strategic studies class. I might be misremembering that. But his extracurriculars really stood out to me. And there was a fair bit in the way of breadcrumbs that you could piece together things he did. He was involved in the Campus Reform Club quite heavily back in from the time he was a first year. And he, through that, got involved in various political campaigns and causes. There was one really interesting story that I document in the book to a pretty significant level of detail, where the Alberta government had hosted or was running a Senate election. Alberta is the only province where senators can be elected, although, as we've seen recently, the federal government does not often look too kindly on these elections. But because of this, the very left-wing student government at the University of Calgary wouldn't recognize the legitimacy of the Senate elections. So when the Campus Reform Club wanted to go around putting up signs for Ted Morton, who was a Calgary professor and one of the Reform Senate candidates, and someone I spoke to in the book, the student council at the university was saying, you can't do this. It's not a real election. They were coming down hard on the club. So what Poilievre and his colleagues did was have a quote unquote funeral for freedom. And they staged this protest where they, said democracy had died, and they marched through the student area, and Jason Kenney was there, and Diana Blonsky, a very young Poilievre, was there. But this was the type of stuff they did. And you mentioned the Model UN. This was another area where Poilievre really immersed himself. And you don't often think of getting involved in Model UN as being the domain of young conservatives. It's overwhelmingly a more left-leaning pastime. But at the University of Calgary, it was a bit different. And it was largely because of Poilievre's leadership that the club had people on the left and people on the right and people that just liked it as a resume line item that were all involved, and they did quite well. They went to competitions in Montreal and at the University of Pennsylvania, and often came out quite well.
Very interesting. So here I am talking with the great author Andrew Lawton, and he's a journalist. And of course, we're talking about the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, and getting to understand who he is and understanding how that relates to, of course, policy, and certainly as him as the Canada's potentially new prime minister. So let's look at this question a little bit further in the sense that when you talk about his campus involvement, was there a sense of how he got along with fellow students? Was he one of these keeners who wanted to debate every issue but just didn't really get along with people? Like, do you have any? Is that, I know that's a tough question to assess after so many years, Andrew, but did you get a flavor for that?
It's a little bit of a there's a bit of a selection bias in the people I spoke to, and that oftentimes the ones that wanted to speak were the ones that had favorable impressions. But generally speaking, the sense I got was that he did get along. I tracked down one former campus UN model UN colleague of his who very significantly different from him politically speaking, but still had very good things to say about the way he was, and said everyone felt very respected and welcome. So well, he sure might have rubbed people the wrong way by virtue of being so outspoken. There was never a sense that I got that he was ever unkind or exclusive with that. In fact, quite the contrary. But to the other point, I will say there were a couple of people that I reached out to that knew him in that sense that said, well, I can't, to use the words that one shared, I can't disentangle my memories from my thoughts of his current politics. So this person didn't want to speak. But again, what I got from that was that it's just that they don't like him now and they don't want that to color the way they felt then. So they might have actually not liked how much they might have liked him back then in context. But no, people had generally good things to say about him.
Well, it's very interesting. So he was a keener, obviously. There's when you talk about the funeral for democracy, if I remember that story
Funeral
well,
for freedom.
for freedom, pardon me. There's a kind of a showmanship that's going on there. Did that begin there in university where, I mean, that's an important skill is marketing and sales of ideas, of policy ideas that are often complex. Is that illustrative of that kind of skill set that Pierre Poilievre has?
I think so. And campus politics, for anyone who's been involved, and I include myself in that category, is often about showmanship. Like it really takes politics to the absurd at some point. And you may think that you're saving the world, but really it just becomes a way for nerds to have fun. That was sort of my own experience on it, not being invited to the big parties. We just, had model parliament instead. But at the same time, he also had the intellectual heft to back up what he was doing. And I think that's key because there are a lot of people that, they have a loose connection to something, but they haven't really put in the deep thought that oftentimes comes across years. Whereas he was reading Ayn Rand in high school. He was reading Milton Friedman in high school. His mother told me when I spoke to her for the book that his favorite book in high school was The Dictionary. Imagine just reading the dictionary for pleasure. Like most people don't even look it up for reference, but he was like reading it from, Aardvark to, Zimbabwe or something. And, or I guess zoology would come after that. Anyway, he was reading it from start to finish and just enjoying that for whatever reason. So he had put in the thought to actually develop his philosophy and his ideology. And the showmanship was a tool to advance that. The showmanship wasn't itself the goal, like it, I think, is for a lot of young activists.
Struck me in the book as well, Andrew, that you're dealing with someone here who has a proclivity to understand a deeper understanding of the intellectual background, the history. So were there particular mentors that made a big impact on him growing up as a young leader?
I don't know about mentors per se, but he did have the opportunity to work with a lot of people who have become quite influential figures in Canada's conservative movement. I mean, the first campaign he ever worked on was in 1997 for a man people may have heard of called Jason Kenney, who was running for his first seat as a Reform Member of Parliament in, I think, Calgary Southwest. And I might be wrong about the exact riding, but he was running in a Calgary election, and Poilievre had just gotten a gig working at his phone bank. And it was funny, that approach that he had to get into the phone bank was because he had wanted a seat on Preston Manning's riding board. So Preston Manning was becoming, the guy in conservatism. He had just been elected. The Reform Party was coming out as a serious political entity. Poilievre at 14, 15 wanted to be on the EDA, and they're like, well, we don't really have a place for you, but listen, if you want to get involved, we've got this phone bank. So they pass him off to the guy running the phone bank, who was Rob Anders, another guy who became a longtime Conservative Member of Parliament. And these were the types of people that he was around, because what often, and I guess I should take a step back here for a moment, David, when I was writing the book, it started out as a strict biography of Pierre Poilievre, but it very quickly morphed into a history of the modern conservative movement. And we can talk about why that is, but in a nutshell, it's because the two stories are so inextricably linked. modern conservatism really has its roots in that populist reform resurgence, that re-innovation of politics in the 90s in Alberta. And that was the same genesis point for Pierre Poilievre's political career. And both of them have really come of age in the same way. So because of that, he was really in the midst of all of these different people that have become monumental figures and influential figures in Canadian conservatism, including Stephen Harper, of course.
The book, quite frankly, Andrew, I was going to comment on it as well, is that you tell a lot of history about the modern conservative policy movement today, which is very interesting. We have a lot of questions from the audience. And in fact, there's some that are perhaps a little bit tongue-in-cheek here. One is from Duff, who asks, what cabinet appointment are you going to assume, Andrew, when you get elected? Wow, that sounds a bit presumptuous, but is there an interest that you have personally as a minister, possibly in the new government?
Listen, I have to win the nomination and then win an election. And if I do, my first role will be to my constituents. But I will say that there are a lot of policy areas that I am interested in and things that have drawn me to wanting to be a part of this government. And, one which sounds insignificant or just like a punchline, but it is a significant one, is defunding the CBC, because I'm coming at this as someone who's been in independent media. And I've seen the rise of independent media because of the failings of the mainstream media to represent Canadians and to speak the truth. So I will, personally bring the close sign over to CBC if I get the chance. Don't need to be in cabinet to do that. Also, a very personal issue for me as someone who has gone through a severe mental health struggle in my past and very nearly ended my life by suicide, is the expansion of assisted suicide to people with mental illness. This is something that I have written about extensively and is literally a life and death issue for vulnerable Canadians. And I will make it and have made it my personal mission to stop that. So that's something that I would very much like to champion personally. And there are other things as well. I mean, I've been a longtime advocate for free speech, and the intrusion of government, especially the federal government, on discourse and on speech rights and the online censorship stuff is tremendously dangerous. And I was in the trenches when we fought against the Canadian Human Rights Commission's so-called hate speech provisions a decade ago, when the Conservatives repealed it. And the fact that it's now coming back with a vengeance is something that needs to be stopped. So these are among my priorities of campaigning.
Sharing that, Andrew, and thank you, Duff, for that question. But no, Andrew, it's in many ways, it struck me as that you're almost a perfect person to write this book about Pierre Poilievre, given your extensive background and experience on these issues and a myriad of others. I mean, I know you undertook it very much as a journalist, but I think it's true. You were an ideal person to write this book.
So one of the things, there were a few people in the parliamentary press gallery bubble and the Ottawa bubble that I know really rolled their eyes when they found out I was going to be writing this book. And Paul Wells, who's not a conservative, but I think he's a very fair-minded journalist, he did a long interview with me when my book came out. And he had talked to some of these people that were saying, whatever. And Paul, actually, I was very honored, gave it his vote of confidence by saying, no, I mean, yes, Andrew is obviously sympathetic to the subject of the book, but it's still a book that makes criticisms where I think they're warranted, but more importantly, keeps my opinion out of it, because I wanted this to be a factual account. But why I think I was so uniquely qualified to write the book is because there are huge issues in, as I mentioned earlier, Canadians telling their stories, but specifically conservatives telling their stories, because we've learned that we have to do it ourselves because the mainstream media will not. And because of that, there is this resistance to putting us out there. And there were a lot of people that took my calls and shared their own bit of Pierre Poilievre's story that never would have taken the call from some Toronto Star journalist or CBC journalist that was writing the book. So my book was obviously written from the perspective of someone who agrees with Pierre Poilievre on a lot of things, but it was because of who I am and the work that I've done that I was actually able to get into all of these places that were necessary to tell that story.
No, I think that's very fair. And what I was struck by the book as well is that it is truly also a bit of a critique of Pierre Poilievre in terms of there's certainly edges to his personality that you explore, and there's different sides to different stories here, and you weren't afraid to do that. So bravo on you. I do have a question as well from Marie Perrin, who asks, "What was Pierre Poilievre's degree in? Was it economics?"
So it was in international relations. And what's interesting is that he actually left university quite early because he got a job offer. So he interned with the Reform Party internship program on Parliament Hill in, I think, 1999. And he ended up getting a job offer a couple of years later from Stockwell Day, who was at the time no longer the leader of the alliance, but he was a member of parliament in Stephen Harper's alliance caucus, and he was the foreign affairs critic. And he had hired Poilievre to work for him. So he actually left university, went to work for Stockwell Day. And it was only when he was elected as an MP that he finished his degree. He was, I think, 1.5 credits short. So he was almost done. And he did it by correspondence at Athabasca University. But the degree was in international relations, and it was from the University of Calgary. However, I think Marie had asked about economics specifically. He has studied economics outside of the university for his entire life. I mean, I mentioned reading Milton Friedman in high school, but if you read a lot of what he's written and said on economics, it is an incredible depth of knowledge that he has about this. And one of the things that I reported on in the book, which had not been written anywhere else, is that he had been in the process of writing his own book about economics, his own book on, basically it was a financial manifesto for Canada. And it was only because the leadership campaign happened that he ran in that he really had to shelve that project. But a lot of the work that he put into it and some of the exact words I've seen seep into other things he's done and said. And for example, the book was going to be called Detonation. Now that's DEBT-O-Nation. It was going to describe Canada's debt as this ticking time bomb. Detonation was the name of one of his mini documentaries that he produced. And a lot of the scripting and the research in that was directly lifted from this never published manuscript. So he spent a lot of time with these issues. And whenever you see him say something on economics, 99 times out of 100, that's him, not some advisor or policy wonk that wrote that.
No, I think that's a very interesting strength from a policy point of view that he does have, is that spending that time and depth to really examine those issues carefully. So, one can really, I think, sense that as he talks about so many issues and then seeks to simplify them appropriately to communicate to a broader audience. And that takes a great amount of skill to do that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. And, there's often this very reductivist view in politics that you have people that are good at policy and people that are good at comms, communications, and these two are always working against each other. And I think there's some truth to that. There are people that are really great at understanding policy, but aren't thinking of how to communicate it. And there are people that can turn anything into a sales pitch, but don't really think about the policy. But Poilievre's unique skill is that he has both of these things, and he develops them really in a collaborative way, because he doesn't think of what the policy is and then how do we sell it, or how do we sell whatever is given to us. He thinks about these two things together and say, good policy is good comms and vice versa. He doesn't actually want to win people over based just on a snappy talking point. I mean, even Axe the Tax. Here's a great example of this. Yes, this is a slogan, and he is beating people over the head with it, but it is a slogan that's rooted in a policy that is incredibly well thought out of how disruptive and devastating the carbon tax is. And look, I'm running in a riding that has a huge agricultural sector, and this is something that has a very real cost to people because the carbon tax is so destructive. So the 3-line slogan is a manifestation of a very deeply thought out policy, both of which are now presented and really moving the needle in Canadian politics, as evidenced by even the BC NDP government, which has been the biggest defender of the carbon tax, saying, yeah, okay, if we don't have to, we won't do it.
So we've got a lot of comments from people, one of which is, of course, Marie said, thank you for answering her question, Andrew. It's interesting that there's also a lot of comments about how Pierre Poilievre is a contrast to the current prime minister, who says Trudeau never worries about economic policy. Laugh out loud. I think that's from My Future. Somebody's commenting about that. So it's rather interesting. But it does point to the idea that Poilievre seems to be unusual, not to overly generalize or be unfair to many elected officials, because so many of them are certainly very insightful, but there's not many that maybe go to that nth degree of that kind of depth in policy areas. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, I think so. And one of the parts of the book that a lot of the Poilievre critics love to pluck out was how demanding he was as an employer, which I think is very much confirmed to me on the record and off the record by people that I spoke to that have worked for him at various points. He has very high expectations of the people that work for him, but he also has very high expectations of himself. And one of the interesting moments or anecdotes that was shared with me by a former staffer of his is that if he's going to bring Poilievre a report or something, he needs to have the primary source. So it can't just be a National Post story that cites some report. He wants the report itself. He wants to see where the people are getting their information from. So that itself is a level of depth in understanding that most people don't want. Most people just want the one-page briefing note that gives them the things they need. But as a result, they have a very shallow understanding of what they're talking about. Whereas he wants to read the 200-page report so that that talking point that comes out is going to be the most accurate and effective talking point.
That's a great strength, to be able to have high expectations, but to demand that one actually gets at primary sources rather than just taking someone else's analysis or word for it. So speaking of policy first principles, I was really intrigued, Andrew, the way you described the story about how Pierre Poilievre, as a young man, wrote a very interesting essay. And it was a contest about if I were prime minister, I would do this. And you talk about it extensively. It's a really well-told story, Andrew. But the emphasis is clearly on the importance of freedom, both as a principle
I have it with me here. This was the...
Oh. So
I brought props. Yeah,
So-
it was. Building Canada Through Freedom was the name of it.
So what is the significance of that essay in, like, this is a profound foundational formational experience for this young man?
Yeah, and just as a bit of context, he wrote this, I think he was 21. He was in university at the time, and it was part of an essay contest by Magna, the automotive manufacturer, led by Frank Stronach, who was a relatively uncontroversial figure up until a few months ago. But the thing with this contest is that he was really articulating, and the prompt was, what would you do as prime minister? So no one can say he hasn't at least thought of these things going back to his younger years. But building Canada through freedom, and why that's so important to me is because it shows a core consistency across his adult life on what he values and how he orients himself and how he believes the Canadian government should orient itself as being an entity that puts freedom front and center. And what was interesting, if you delve into the exact wording, is that there was so much in the way of parallel between what he wrote in this essay and the messaging he shares now. And in fact, there are sections of it where I compared two paragraphs, and I'm like, this is literally the identical thing. Even, the words are similar, and in some cases identical. And it shows that on the core things, his positions have remained unchanged for coming up on 25 years now.
No, it's truly fascinating. So that's a very important principle that we need to underline, is that a key policy principle is freedom here. So do you have a sense that Pierre Poilievre would then describe himself as a classical liberal? At Frontier, we talk a lot about the 10 principles of classical liberalism, including the emphasis on, well, things like individual property rights and freedom of speech. I mean, there's a whole series of them. But is that how he self-describes?
My sense would be that he would reject the premise that he has to describe himself or apply a label. That would be my theory on this, because Generally speaking, his point, and I actually spend a fair bit of time in the book describing what type of conservative he is, because in conservative politics, we often have this so-called big blue tent that we all have to view, where it's a big blue tent, and underneath it you have your libertarians, your social conservatives, your red Tories, your blue Tories, your Quebec conservatives, your classical liberals, your rural, like you have all of these different groups, and we all have to get along with each other. And the problem is that there's often this tug of war between the two factions. You often have, for example, social conservatives and red Tories clashing, Quebec conservatives and Alberta conservatives. And I think Poilievre has really tried to flip the script on that. And I describe him as a relatively new term, which is a movement conservative. And that is someone who basically has tracked their own approach to the evolution of the conservative movement over time. And, even the freedom discourse, this has been a relatively recent one in Canadian politics, in that it's been reinvented post-COVID to mean something very different. And I asked him during the leadership race in an interview, not connected to the book, because the book I hadn't started yet. But I said, how do you keep all of these groups together that I just mentioned? And he had said freedom. And his answer was, all of them want freedom in some way. Social conservatives want religious freedom. Red Tories want freedom for minorities and vulnerable groups. And rural conservatives want freedom from government intrusion in their property rights. And it was really, I think, a unique answer in that it showed that he believes freedom is the common denominator of all types of conservatives. And that's something we really haven't heard. And if you contextualize that with his win in the leadership race, with like 70 some odd % of the points on the first ballot, that is because he had this broad appeal that we just don't see in our party's history. It's not what Aaron O'Toole had when he won. It's not what Andrew Scheer had when he won. And even Stephen Harper did not have that great a margin of victory. So I think it's showing that he's trying to reject those labels that would close him off to people that identify by a different label.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Again, the principle of freedom as a way to unify everybody in a big tent, that is founded on principles of integrity here. I do have a question from Sandy on the chat. Where can this book be published? Or, sorry, pardon me, where can it be purchased? As I was thinking about the publisher as Sutherland Books. But where can we buy this, Andrew?
Pretty much anywhere. Indigo does have it in stores all across the country, and Amazon has it as well. And you can also get it direct from the publisher, which is at Sutherland House Books. But yes, to answer the Indigo aspect specifically, it is there.
The other question I have is, when we think of heroes, I think you cite a number of role models for Pierre Poilievre, but one of them is Churchill. Why is that?
He's always been a big admirer of Churchill from a leadership perspective, and certainly he's well steeped in knowledge of Churchill. But one of the most direct areas where he has drawn from Churchill is in the use of language. One of the things that Churchill, who was, by the way, not a natural public speaker, in fact, he was quite a bad public speaker by a lot of conventional standards, but at the time was a very commanding and compelling one, because he really worked hard to practice and deliver speeches, I think a dozen times before he delivered them publicly. And in his speech writing, there was some tremendous lesson that Poilievre has adapted, which is to use Anglo-Saxon languages to make sure that your words can be understood by people. And Poilievre does not view oratory as a way to show off and to show how smart you are, and to use what he calls Latin, which is basically words in English emanating from the Latin tradition rather than the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So he has said politicians need to use simple, clear Anglo-Saxon language, and he has extended that to say that he thinks governments should use that. So he would actually overhaul government communications in this way, but that is directly drawn from Churchill's approach.
Very good. So if we talk about Pierre Poilievre as a decision maker, I mean, obviously there's many different aspects of decision making and ways of thinking, both strategic and tactical. Andrew, I'm wondering if you can help us understand first the tactical sides to his decision making. Like, is he quite a shrewd individual? I think that comes out in the book. And then strategically, he's thinking about things in advance, not just in the short term, but the long term. Is that a fair comment?
I think so. He's a chess player. And I think, like a lot of chess players, he's thinking several moves ahead. And he wants to understand all of the different scenarios where if I do this, then they'll do this. And then if I do this, they'll do this. And he's running these things through. And where this becomes a bit of a detrimental thing is that it means that sometimes even simple decisions take a long time because he's running through all these scenarios instead of just saying, all right, let's just do it and be decisive and do it now. People who worked for him had shared with me. But he also wants to get it right. And he wants to understand all of the calculations and all of the scenarios and possible outcomes before he does something. And it's not like we see in contrast where he's trying to let polls govern him. He's not trying to do the most popular thing, but he's trying to understand the implications of the actions and choose certain fights accordingly. So there is a tactical aspect to it, but he also never compromises that core belief that's underlying it. And that's, I think, where you'd contrast, and I would anyway, Pierre Poilievre with other conservative leaders in the past, where the ideas are malleable to the comms and to the outcomes. Whereas Poilievre is saying, no, our core beliefs are not changing, but how we message them, which ones we prioritize, those will change based on, all of these other considerations.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, we actually have a question for you from Brad. He asks, how is your nomination going?
Well, so far so good. I haven't won yet, but I haven't lost. So the big uncertainty of these things is always timing, which takes place in a bit of a black box. But if you've ever been involved in a political nomination in Canada, it's really a one singular focus, which is on selling memberships to people who live in the riding who will join the party and agree to vote for you in the nomination. So, it's great. I have an audience nationally, and I love that. But, unless you can vote in my riding, you can't help directly in that way. Although people can donate, and many have from across the country, which I'm very grateful for. But it's going really well. And I think that there's been, and to tie it back to the book, there's been this major conservative resurgence in Canada where it feels good to be conservative again. And people are tired of being told by the media, you have to apologize for your beliefs. People are tired of being sneered at by the government. And people are really feeling proud and unapologetic about who they are and what they believe now. And I think that I've been able to capture a lot of that through my show, and which is why I've been very grateful. So many people have been happy that I'm, flipping from a media role to a political role now. And I think as I talk to conservatives in the riding, both capital C and small c, there really is a sense of that. So it's going well, but, never want to take anything for granted. So the fight continues.
Indeed. Very well said. And speaking of history and pride, I guess one of the things that came out very much in your book is that Poilievre has a sense of both history, but also real genuine pride in our country. And I mean, is that a theme that you think will come out in a potentially conservative government?
I think so. I think it goes back to what I said a moment ago about being unapologetic. The idea that, just to use Justin Trudeau as an example, Justin Trudeau has spent most of his time when he speaks about Canada really apologizing for Canada and speaking in very negative terms about this country and what it does. And it's interesting that Poilievre gets criticized by the elites for not respecting institutions when he's the one who's standing up there and saying, we need to protect and preserve and defend the greatest institution of all, which is the nation of Canada, the Dominion of Canada. And it's funny that he gets criticized by people who wouldn't hesitate to throw the entire country under the bus at every turn for doing that.
Okay. So, but in that context, it's fascinating that as a communicator, at least this is what I've learned from your book and would observe on the national stage, is you have this fascinating paradox where you do have, various political party leaders really take shots at institutions as inherently racist or wrong. I mean, it's a grossly oversimplistic narrative of history. Things are, much more complex, and people made decisions as a reflection of their unique time. But and we can learn from those lessons of history. But what I find interesting is that Poilievre, it seems like he has the depth of historical knowledge and policy to basically come back and debate those issues. And again, here's that debater in him, that he doesn't fall for just simply cowering under those kinds of thoughtless attacks that denigrate our country. Is that your
Yeah,
insight as well?
yeah, I think so. And just to take a slight deviation, if you'll indulge me, and I'll get back to the point, but I think it's a relevant comparison here. Just look at the way that he engages with the media. So the media will ask him a question, a journalist will ask him a question, and instead of answering it, if he thinks it's loaded or unfair based on a false premise, he'll call that reporter out. And it's made for some very tense and sometimes very awkward exchanges. We all know the infamous Apple one, but he doesn't want to get sucked into a rhetorical trap by answering a question that's based on a premise that he thinks is flawed. Like, someone says, people say this, and he's saying, what people? And they can't put up a single example. So I think the reality is he doesn't view the sacred cows that are, or that he's supposed to, as sacred cows, the ones that the media says. So when he criticizes the Bank of Canada governor, you get all this hand wringing from Andrew Coyne and the Laurentian elite saying, oh no, you can't do that. And he's saying, why not? They have failed Canadians. So I'm not going to put them on this pedestal where they can't be criticized because of that. And I think that's what's so key here, is that he has a great deal of respect for institutions, but no respect for when those institutions have failed Canadians. And he's not going to hold them up as being above criticism.
You're spot on, Andrew, in the sense that he's not above critiquing elites who have let down people in this country. And he's not going to bow down before the, dare I say, the gods of wokeism. But he's trying to take a tolerant tone in terms of policy and that kind of behavior. But is that kind of threading the needle here, that he wants the line?
I think so. And I would also bring it back to the carbon tax, which we were talking about briefly earlier. A few years ago, you had the Conservative Party running on a carbon tax. And they could say, oh, well, ours is better than the Liberals' carbon. You're still running as a carbon tax. You are accepting the left's premise. And you had so-called conservative commentators, so-called conservative strategists that were going up and down saying, oh, the conservatives, if they want to stay relevant, if they want to win, they need to have a carbon tax. Conservatives have to have a carbon tax. They were giving up the premise to the left. And what has Poilievre done? He has turned the carbon tax into his greatest selling point as a policy. He has forced provinces to turn on the federal government over the carbon tax. I mentioned David Eby in British Columbia. He has forced the BC NDP, which fought in court to defend the carbon tax, to now disavow it. So there's an example of flipping the script on your opponents, because all of these chattering class types that said we need a carbon tax, even some from the, again, Conservative Party, he was saying, no, you're all failing Canadians right now. This is a bad policy, and we shouldn't go along with it just because we feel it's the most politically advantageous thing to do. And he's proved them wrong.
So I'm talking with Andrew Lawton, the author, journalist. He's the author of the book Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, and it's certainly a very engaging conversation, Andrew, and we've got a lot of comments from the chat. In fact, Duff has just complimented the conversation, and thank you for this thoughtful, insightful discussion. So thank you, Duff, for that kind comment. So keep the questions coming. It's very interesting, Andrew. So we're dealing then with a potential future prime minister who is not afraid to be hemmed in by the left's narrative, by like other parties. The NDP and the Liberals are obviously within that more socialist narrative. So he's not been captured or confined by that policy world, which is really significant. I mean, I think of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who famously spoke about the kind of the left-wing ratchet, in the sense that a kind of a Labour government would come into power and would tilt the country in a certain direction, and the Conservatives would come in, but fail to move back into the center or in another direction that would be better serving of the people. Is that kind of the dynamic then? So this prime minister then, from a policy point of view, Pierre Poilievre, could be actually a game-changing prime minister from a policy point of view. Is that what you're getting at?
I think so. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of speculation about what a Poilievre government would look like, which right now seems like a pretty near certainty in Canadian politics if you look at poll numbers, with the obvious caveats. But I think one thing that I will say, and I say it in the book, and I can say it now as a prospective candidate, is that it will be ambitious. And I think because Canada needs that. I mean, right now, people are hanging on by a thread. The number of businesses that have shut down in the last few years, the number of people that are teetering on the brink of poverty, that are teetering on the brink of losing their homes, and then people that, could never lose a home because they'll never be able to buy a home, or that's how they feel now. So you don't solve drastic problems with little tiny moderate and by that I mean incremental solutions. So I think there are going to have to be some very significant changes that take place, and I do think he's up for that. But I also know that that's what terrifies the left so much, is because they've spent the last decade building up these bad policies, and they don't want to see them all taken away as quickly as I think many will have to be.
Remarkable. Even the level of federal spending alone has been more than all previous governments combined. So it's really quite a
and the size of government.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the skills that this potentially future prime minister brings, whether it's in sales and marketing and communication. And it's funny, when it relates to communication, we have this propensity to create kind of slogans like just inflation, and it's almost comical. So it almost ties in with his initial Christmas video of so-called gifts from Justin Trudeau. So it's quite interesting, how do you communicate well policy ideas to a larger public? Would you say that is his greatest strength, or what would you say are his greatest strengths?
I don't know if I'd say, coming up with alliterations and slogans is his greatest strength, but I think it's a reflection of his greatest strength, which is understanding policy and how to communicate policy in a way that makes it relevant and attainable and accessible to Canadians. And look, I mean, here are the language, here are the terms we've heard in the last few weeks: sellout sing, carbon tax carney, costly coalition. I mean, these are things that he has said that a lot of the Laurentian elites will again roll their eyes at because they sound glib, but what they are snappy and memorable. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I can't remember if I write about it in the book, but I've certainly talked about it with friends, the term gatekeeper has entered the popular lexicon and the popular consciousness right now in a way that it never had before Poilievre started talking about the gatekeepers, ending the gatekeepers, getting rid of the gatekeepers. So he has actually, in a way, injected that term into day-to-day political discourse by virtue of using it. And as a result, everyone knows what it means. When he says they're being a gatekeeper, he knows it's talking about some bureaucrat standing in the way of progress, standing in the way of prosperity. So I don't think that the language itself is his greatest skill, but it's a reflection of and a symptom of his greatest skill.
Well said. Let's talk about the image of Pierre Poilievre. It seems like some have accused him of being a kind of an attack dog, partisan attack dog for the Conservatives years ago. And it seems like today he has shed his glasses. He's dressing more casually. What does that say? What's going on there?
Well, the people around him insisted that there was nothing deliberate about losing the glasses, that it wasn't some, Preston Manning-esque makeover from the 90s. It was just, he just decided to, get rid of the glasses and start wearing some casual clothes. So they say there was nothing to see here, and that's their line, and they're sticking to it. But that, to be honest, it may be the case. He says his wife likes him better without glasses, and I, as a married man, understand the importance of keeping the women in our lives very happy. But the reality that I think will affect a lot of people is that the Liberals are desperately trying to brand him in a way that is not sticking. They're talking about American politics and the far right and this and that. I think Chrystia Freeland this week said Maple MAGA or something like that, but it's not working. It's not working. Ordinary Canadians are seeing in Poilievre someone that they do trust to lead the country and to repair the damage from Justin Trudeau. And I think that in that context, it's important to know that he's done a pretty good job at branding himself and showing that he's not that. But yeah, early on in his career, he was the partisan pit bull attack dog in the House of Commons. That was his role. He did it well, but that was only ever just one aspect of his identity.
Yeah, let's look at the complete story and the complete picture of his career, and that was his job, is to be the member of the loyal opposition. That's how our parliamentary system works, is to actually try to hold the government to account. So one of the things I wanted to shift then to is if we could talk a little bit about the whole leadership campaign. And it's interesting how you brilliantly tell stories about how they went to Kitchener, a venue, they went to London, and then they ended up in Windsor during a day of events for supporters. And they showed up at these venues, and there were hundreds of more people than they expected. And the crowds grew and grew to the point where they would have venues of well over 1,000 or 2,000 people. In fact, I think it was where was it, in Calgary, Andrew? You said there was a venue that was well over 5,000.
Yes, Calgary and Edmonton were 5,000 and 8,000. I can't remember which was which, but massive, even by Alberta standards.
Rather of communication and drawing of pictures and policy that mobilized a number of Canadians that said, look, I think you cite back in the book that there was a person there with tears in their eyes who said, I only have $6.83 in my bank account. And this person brings me hope that I will be in a better Canada. What's going on here? How do you look at that campaign and how that unfolded?
It's interesting because when I heard that story, it was from Jenny Byrne, who is one of Poilievre's closest advisors, and she was telling me about this woman that was just weeping as she tried to put the last bit of money she had to buy a membership to vote for Pierre, and I at the time I believed it, and I saw Jenny Byrne actually tear up as she was telling that story, and it's something that I had never witnessed. I knew was out there because I would get it to my show, people writing these very heartfelt emails, people that had lost everything during COVID. They had been out of work because of vaccine mandates. Their business had been shut down, whatever. And now that I'm a candidate or trying to be a candidate, I'm actually having some of those conversations myself of people. Literally, I've had several say, I would love to support you. I believe in you. I do not have $15 that I can spend on a membership. And maybe it's just a convenient way to, get the annoying politician off their doorstep or whatnot. But I believe it's sincere in these people. That's where so many people are. When I say they're hanging on by a thread, they're on the brink, where even the $15 that it would cost to get a membership to vote in a leadership or a nomination, that's the difference between a meal or two and not eating a meal or two. That's actually significant. And, I asked Poilievre in an interview December of last year. So the book was almost done, but it wasn't for the book. It was on my show. And I had said, like, what do you do about that? Like, how do you save those people? Because that's basically what they're asking you to do, and they're thinking you will do. And it was only a couple of moments we had left in the interview, but you could tell it was something that weighed on him, that he realizes that, yeah, he has a path to win and a path to be the prime minister. But there are a lot of people who are really expecting him and needing him to do something that is more than just, oh, yeah, I want CBCD funded and I want to do this and that. Like, there are people whose lives depend on what happens in the next few years. And that's a heck of a burden for any one person to have to carry.
So are you saying, Andrew, that during that incredible campaign and mobilization of tens of thousands of people for his campaign alone, that really touched him in terms of a leader that, like, often it's difficult to get out of these decision-making bubbles like the Ottawa bubble or any provincial capital, is without that contact with real people, you don't really understand how people are really suffering in this country. Did that change him?
I don't know. It's tough to say. And I didn't actually interview him for the book. So some of the questions like that I would have loved to have done, because there's no other way to get insight into someone's mind, I didn't get a chance to do. But I've seen how he engages with these people, and I've seen how he does it. For example, after everyone who has rallies, despite how well attended they are, he waits around for what's often hours to get a photo with every single person who wants one. These photo lines stretch on for hours and hours, and he shakes their hand, and every person gets a moment to share something with him. And it's not a hugely long conversation, but he's doing that. And that there's not really a direct benefit. He's already done the speech. They've come out. He's already had his moment to talk to them, but he does that one-on-one. And I think it's because he genuinely cares about that. And he doesn't want his experience with and his relationship with the people to be mediated by someone else. He doesn't want to be the king in the castle that's so far away from the peasants. He wants to be a man of the people who's trying to represent these people. And for that, he needs to hear about what they need and what their struggles are. And I will say there's a reason that he was reelected in 2015, which was that election when conservatives were just wiped out across the country. In Ottawa, every conservative MP lost their seat except for him. And it's because he had put in that work over the preceding, at that point, 11 years that he'd been an MP, to engage with people on a one-on-one level.
There's an interesting comment from Dallas, who says, Pierre is what Canada needs right now, given the levels of corruption is beyond belief. For God's sake, remove the current government, wake up before it's too late. So that's a pretty strong opinion. But thank you very much, Dallas, for that comment. It says, my future, it says a PM should be a man of the people. Thank you for those comments. So let's turn to his relationship with the media. And we've talked about that a little bit. And I have a clip here I would certainly like to share about kind of a typical interaction. I think it's a fascinating one.
This free trade deal.
The carbon tax was inserted by Justin Trudeau, not by my supporters. Why did he do that? No, but I'm just curious. Can you explain to me why there was a carbon tax in the agreement?
No, but the question is why.
No, I asked you a question. You keep asking what the agreement.
We're the journalists. This is democracy. We ask the question.
I have the freedom to ask questions if I want to, and I've just answered. I've been answering your questions all week.
Here's another one.
So no.
The government's introducing
why would they
an
do a
investment
carbon
tax
tax?
credit.
You're not changing the subject. I know you want to change the subject.
No, I want to ask
because you don't want to talk about Trudeau's carbon tax.
I want to ask a question because in a democracy we ask the question and you answer.
And I decide the answer I give. And the answer is this: we will axe the tax. And Trudeau can try to divide Canadians by putting a carbon tax in a free trade agreement that we already had for years. It won't change a thing.
It's misleading.
Because I will axe the tax, and I will axe the tax with delight and with passion and with incredible speed. So when I'm Prime Minister, you will be shocked at the speed with which I will axe the tax. And the Canadian people will be able to look up at the gas stations and see the prices coming down. And Trudeau can try to distract from his hated carbon tax by putting it in a free trade amendment to a pre-existing agreement. It won't stop me because I will axe the tax, I will axe the tax, and I will axe the tax. Thank you.
So did you catch that, Andrew? He's saying he's going to axe the tax. So that's a key policy. So what's going on there in that media interaction? It's really
by the way, I love that last week, I forget who it was, some outlet said Poilievre has a secret agenda. And he was at that day, he was speaking in front of this backdrop that had like axe the tax written 19 times. And he was at a lectern that had axe the tax written on. I'm like, yeah, what could the agenda possibly be? No one has any idea. Look, he's unequivocal about it. And that's where I go back to a few moments ago, what I was saying about how he has changed the way that we were told by those in officialdom we were supposed to view the carbon tax. And he's also done it with the media there by saying, listen, you guys may want to talk about all this stuff. Here's what I want to talk about. Here's what Canadians are talking about, and that's that. And he also spoke to that speed aspect we were discussing and saying you will be shocked at how quickly it's done. So I think it'll be a day one priority for the government.
Well, look, I want to thank you, Andrew, for joining this conversation and for your incredible job writing this book about perhaps a future prime minister and understanding better about his story and his policy priorities. So, and also, we certainly wish you all the best with your nomination. and process, and commend you for being involved in the political process, Andrew. And it's been a pleasure to have you here today.
It's been my pleasure, David. Thank you, and thank you to your audience as well.
Again, to Andrew Lawton and also to our audience for participating, and we certainly encourage you to buy the book, learn more about our political leaders, regardless of their political party. And we also invite you to share this, subscribe, like it. We think these are important issues that Canadians should learn about in terms of our political process, and we're grateful that we could have this time together on the frontier. So be sure to share it, and be sure to join us next week on the same time on Thursday. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.